The first time they saw it, the creature was standing in the mist, tall, lean, and watching. Its eyes caught the flashlight like glass, glowing with an intelligence that froze every man in his tracks. They fired without thinking, the gunfire echoing through the Michigan pines. But when the smoke cleared, it was gone. No blood, no tracks, just claw marks on the trees, fresh, deep, and steaming in the cold night air. Hours later, as the wind died and the forest went still, they heard it again, breathing behind them. What they shot that night wasn't an animal. It was something that learned to survive being killed. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the Michigan forest wrapped in a damp, uneasy stillness, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin like a warning. The team had set up their small camp along the edge of the pines, their flashlights slicing through the fog in jittery, nervous sweeps. The forest floor was slick with rain and old leaves, the air thick with the smell of wet pine and gun oil. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something moved, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be deer. The men stopped talking then, their breath misting in the cold air, as if the woods itself were listening. It had started as a simple call, reports of livestock being torn apart on the outskirts of a rural town, deep scratches along barn doors, and howling that didn't belong to any known predator. Locals whispered the name Dogman, laughing uneasily when they said it, but no one truly believed it until they saw the bodies. The animals weren't eaten. They were shredded, left in patterns almost ritualistic. When the deputy radioed in that something was stalking his cruiser, the task force was sent in to investigate. No one expected to find anything, until they did. By dusk, the fog rolled in thick enough to erase the world beyond 50 feet. Their radios crackled with static, a faint rhythmic distortion underneath the noise, almost like breathing. The sergeant ordered the men to spread out in pairs, keeping the truck headlights pointed toward the woods. Each man carried a rifle, though no one could say what they were expecting to shoot. The forest felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with nature. Even the insects had gone quiet. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. The first sound came from the ridge, not a howl, but a sharp, guttural bark followed by the crash of branches. The echo rolled through the trees like thunder, and every beam of light snapped toward the noise. They caught movement just for a second, tall, grey, and impossibly fast. One man shouted, opening fire into the fog, the recoil lighting up the night in flashes of gunfire. Something massive darted between the trees, moving low to the ground, circling them. Then the noise stopped. The woods went dead again, heavier than before. When they advanced to check for a body, the ground was torn apart. Deep gouges clawed into the soil, trees splintered, and pieces of something, fur maybe, stuck to the bark. But there was no blood, no tracks leading away. Whatever they'd hit, it hadn't fallen. The sergeant ordered everyone back to camp, but unease followed them like a shadow. Even the forest seemed to shift with their movement, the fog curling around their boots as if trying to pull them under. That night the fire barely held. The wind rose and fell without rhythm, carrying faint sounds that no one wanted to acknowledge. Heavy footsteps, low groans, and once something that sounded almost like a human voice repeating their names. The men sat in silence, weapons resting across their knees, every eye trained on the tree line. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped. The sound was clean, deliberate, and too close. Then another, then breathing, deep, rasping, and wet. They moved as one, flashlights slicing through the dark, rifles raised. The beams caught nothing but swirling mist. Then one of the lights flickered, dimmed, and died completely. In that instant, something moved past them, unseen, but close enough to stir the air. The corporal spun around, firing blind into the trees. The recoil echoed like lightning, followed by silence so thick it felt wrong. When the smoke cleared, one of the men was missing. Only his rifle lay on the ground, still warm to the touch. The sergeant called out his name, his voice trembling despite the authority it tried to hold. The forest didn't answer, not with sound, but with motion. From the dark came a shape, tall and narrow, almost human, but bent wrong. Its outline shimmered between the trees, eyes catching the firelight for a single breath before vanishing again. The men opened fire, the gunshots overlapping, the forest erupting with noise and flashes of light. And then, as suddenly as it began, the night went still. When the smoke cleared, the ground near the tree line was torn open. The fog had thickened again, swallowing their visibility. The sergeant stepped forward cautiously, flashlight shaking in his hand. The beam caught a smear of something on the bark. Black, glistening, and steaming faintly in the cold air. Not blood, not oil, something else entirely. It smelled metallic, almost electric, and it hummed when touched. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding, realizing the substance was vibrating. The men began arguing about leaving. Half wanted to pull out before dawn, but the sergeant refused to retreat without confirming what they'd seen. He ordered a perimeter watch, though none of them felt safe staying still. Hours passed. The fire died low, their nerves stretched thin. Just before sunrise, a sound rolled through the trees again. Slow, dragging footsteps circling the camp. Every man froze, eyes darting toward the noise. The steps stopped. Then, in the glow of the dying fire, they saw the shape standing just beyond the light. It was tall, taller than any man there, its body thin but strong, covered in matted fur slick with rain. Its face was wrong, stretched and angular, the jaw too long, the eyes too human. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a breath, a shuddering exhale that felt like the forest itself was breathing through it. The sergeant fired first, a single shot straight into its chest. The creature stumbled back, then rose again. It didn't fall, it didn't even bleed. The rest opened fire, the crack of rifles blending into a roar that drowned the world. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, the smoke thick enough to hide everything. When the last shell hit the ground, the creature was gone. No sound, no trail, no blood. Just the wind returning, soft and cold, as if nothing had ever happened. The sergeant ordered everyone to reload and check their sectors. But the forest had already gone quiet again. Too quiet, like the world after a scream. At dawn, they searched the area in full daylight. The fog had lifted, revealing a landscape torn apart, trees shredded, soil ripped open, and claw marks gouged deep into metal and rock. The only sign of life was a set of footprints, massive, humanoid, and scorched into the earth as though burned there. They followed the tracks until they ended abruptly near a riverbank. The last print was half submerged, and beside it lay a single spent bullet casing, the same caliber they'd fired the night before. When they returned to town, they filed their report. The official record labeled it as a misidentified animal attack, though none of the men ever spoke about it again. 2 left the force within weeks, another vanished entirely. The sergeant stayed quiet until his death, leaving behind a single note found tucked inside his old service jacket. It read, "Wadaged, we shot it. It looked at us. It smiled." Years later, locals still talk about that night, the storm, the gunfire, and the screams that carried through the trees. Hunters say they still hear something out there, something that moves on 2 legs and howls only when it rains. The forest, they say, never really went quiet again, because on that night, the woods didn't just stop breathing, they started listening. The morning after the gunfire, the forest looked as if a storm had torn through it. Trees splintered, soil churned up, and the smell of gunpowder still lingered faintly in the air. The men stood in a loose circle around the clearing, rifles slung low, eyes fixed on the ground. There were tracks everywhere, deep impressions pressed into the wet soil. At first glance, they looked animal-wide, clawed, heavy. But the longer they stared, the more wrong they appeared. Each print had a shape too deliberate, too symmetrical, toes, heels, and an arch that looked disturbingly human. The sergeant knelt by one of the tracks, brushing aside loose leaves. "It's walking upright," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. The others gathered close, exchanging uneasy glances. The prints were spaced evenly apart, about 6 feet from one to the next. Whatever made them was tall, taller than a man, and it wasn't running. It was walking. Calm, confident. The kind of stride that belonged to something that didn't need to hurry because it had nothing to fear. They followed the trail deeper into the woods, their boots crunching against frost-hardened leaves. Every few yards, the prints grew sharper. The soil pressed deeper as if the creature had gotten heavier. Sometimes, a handprint appeared beside a footprint, long-fingered, clawed, but unmistakably shaped like a hand. The corporal muttered something about hoaxes, but his voice shook. There were no signs of fabrication, no rope marks, no boot treads. The ground itself told the truth. Whatever made those prints was real. The forest grew darker the deeper they went. The trees closed in overhead, blocking the morning light, and the mist thickened again until it hung like smoke between the trunks. The radio operator tried to check in with the base, but all he got was static, a constant hiss that pulsed like a heartbeat. The sergeant ordered him to keep trying. The static never changed, except for one moment when a whisper cut through. Behind you. They froze. When they turned, the woods were empty. Hours passed. The prints led them along a narrow ravine, the air growing colder with every step. The farther they went, the fresher the tracks looked, as if the creature were only minutes ahead. Every time they paused, the forest went still. No wind, no birds, no sound at all. It was as though the woods were holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. The sergeant called for a break, and that's when one of the men noticed something new. The tracks had changed direction. They weren't following it anymore. It was circling them. Panic started to bloom like frostbite. The corporal raised his rifle and scanned the trees, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then came the sound, faint, deliberate footsteps, slow and steady, moving in a wide arc around their position. Each step matched the prints they'd been following. The footsteps stopped whenever they did, resumed whenever they moved. The sergeant ordered everyone into a defensive formation, but there was no target, no shape, just that unrelenting rhythm moving just beyond sight. When they finally found the creature's resting place, it wasn't a den or a nest. It was a clearing of flattened grass and crushed bark. The ground was wet and dark, not from rain, but from something that looked like oil or tar. At the center there was a deep impression shaped like a body, as if something enormous had been lying there. The smell was overpowering, metal, rot, and something faintly electric, like ozone after lightning. The biologist knelt to collect a sample, but the moment his container touched the ground, the fluid began to vibrate. It hummed like it was alive. They left the clearing in silence. The air seemed thicker now, pressing in around them. The trail of prints resumed just past the site, but something about them was different. They were smaller now, lighter, more human. Almost like the creature was changing as it moved, adapting. One set of prints even showed the faint outline of boot treads overlaying claws, as if something was learning to imitate them. The sergeant stared at it for a long time before whispering, "It's watching us." As night fell, they reached the edge of a small river. The prints led straight into the water, disappearing beneath the current. They spread out along the bank, searching for where it might have crossed, but found nothing. No splash marks, no disturbance. The surface was calm, undisturbed, reflecting the darkening sky. The corporal stepped closer, crouching to peer at the surface. That's when the ripples began, gentle, circular, as if something just below was breathing. The sergeant grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The water stilled immediately. They stood frozen, staring at their reflections. For a split second, one of those reflections blinked. The man whose reflection had moved stumbled backward, his breath catching. "It's in the water," he whispered, voice breaking. But when they shined their lights down, there was nothing. The river flowed quietly, like it had swallowed the moment whole. They set up camp on higher ground, forming a rough perimeter with what little energy remained. No one slept. Every sound in the night was magnified. The creak of branches, the soft rush of wind, the crackle of the fire. At one point, the radio sputtered to life again. Though none of them touched it, a faint voice came through, strained and distant, repeating a message they'd heard before. "Don't follow the tracks." The voice was the sergeant's, but he was sitting right there, staring at the flames. By dawn, the trail had returned. Prints in the mud led away from their camp, down toward the ravine again. Only this time, there were more of them. Too many. As if more than one creature had joined the hunt, the men stared at the ground. Realizing that some of the footprints weren't just beside their camp, they started inside it. Something had been there while they slept. The sergeant ordered them to pack up immediately, but when they turned to leave, they saw the same prints behind them, heading the opposite direction, leading back the way they'd come. The deeper they went, the more distorted the footprints became. Some were half-formed, dragging across the dirt like something struggling to maintain shape. Others appeared almost normal, bare human feet, large and slender, as if the creature had begun walking among them unseen. The corporal whispered that maybe it wasn't hunting them anymore. Maybe it was learning from them. The thought sank into their minds like poison, spreading quiet dread through every step they took. By midday, the trail ended abruptly in an open clearing. No trees, no shadows, just wind sweeping over cracked soil. The last print stood alone at the center. A perfect human footprint burned into the earth, glowing faintly at the edges. No tracks led away. It was as if the creature had stepped out of the world entirely. The biologist reached out, hovering his hand above it, but the heat coming off the mark was unbearable. "It's alive," he said softly. "The ground is alive." They left the woods before sunset, each man avoiding the other's eyes. Back at base, no one could explain what they'd seen. The official report dismissed the evidence as erosion, a trick of the mud and light, but at night, the sergeant woke to find dirt on his boots, fine, dark soil like the kind from the Michigan woods. And sometimes, when the room went quiet, he swore he could hear footsteps outside his window, slow, even, too human to follow. The third night in the woods came colder than the rest. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the fog settled thick across the ground like breath from something sleeping beneath the soil. The men huddled around their dim fire, speaking little, listening instead to the noises the forest made when it thought no one was watching. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made their hands twitch toward their rifles. But when the forest finally went quiet, completely quiet, they realized that silence was worse. The kind of silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. The sergeant had just finished a perimeter check when the first sound reached them. A deep, low vibration that didn't quite fit into any category of noise. It wasn't an animal call, nor was it mechanical. It rolled through the trees like distant thunder, but seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath them trembled faintly. The corporal whispered that it was the wind, but there was no wind. The fire flickered sideways, not upward, and every man looked toward the dark tree line as if expecting it to move. Then came the second growl, closer, clearer, and long enough to make their bones vibrate. It rose from low and guttural to something that almost carried tone, like a voice forced through teeth. It didn't echo the way sound should. It felt inside their skulls, resonating against thought rather than air. One of the men stumbled backward, clutching his head, saying it felt like someone had whispered directly into his mind. The sergeant signaled for lights, and flashlights snapped on, cutting thin lines through the fog. The forest stood still, but it was watching. A movement to the right drew every beam in unison. Between the trees, 2 points of light gleamed, reflective, intelligent, hovering just above the mist. They blinked once, not like animal eyes, but deliberate, controlled. The sergeant took aim and shouted a warning, though his voice cracked mid-sentence. No response. The eyes blinked again and vanished, but the growl remained, weaving through the darkness like a breath that never ended. It came from all sides now, encircling them in invisible motion. Someone fired. The muzzle flash split the night, lighting up trunks and fog in violent orange bursts. The growl cut off instantly. The echo of the gunshot stretched long and thin through the forest until it died entirely. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then, from deep within the trees, a single branch snapped, deliberate and sharp. The sergeant shouted for everyone to hold position. No one moved. It wasn't just close, it was right there. The corporal swept his light toward the sound and froze. The beam landed on a shape halfway hidden behind a tree, tall, grey-black, and covered in thick matted fur. The light reflected off its eyes again, but this time they weren't glowing. They were moving, narrowing, adjusting to the glare. Before anyone could react, it stepped forward, slow and deliberate, revealing a long muzzle and shoulders that stretched wider than any man. It exhaled, and the sound came out as a growl low enough to shake the ground. They fired in unison. The flashes turned the forest into a strobe of chaos, light, smoke, movement, breath. The creature jerked but didn't fall. Bullets hit, but instead of blood, something black misted from its wounds, dissolving mid-air. It turned its head toward them, not in pain but curiosity. The sergeant screamed to keep shooting, but his voice sounded small beneath the roar of gunfire. Then the beast opened its mouth wide and let out a sound that wasn't quite a howl and not quite human screaming, a sound that fractured the silence itself. The growl grew louder, rising into a pitch that rattled metal and cracked glass. Their floodlights flickered, radios exploded into static, and one of the rifles jammed. The man holding it dropped to his knees, clutching his head as blood began to trickle from his ears. The others dragged him back, firing wildly into the shadows. They didn't aim anymore, they just wanted the sound to stop. But it didn't. It changed, became a rhythm, a pulse, like the heartbeat of something enormous waking up beneath their feet. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the growl stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The air felt thick, heavy, almost alive. The fire had gone out completely, leaving them in the thin glow of dying flashlights. The sergeant barked orders: reload, regroup, move to the trucks, but no one answered right away. They were listening, because somewhere, faint and distant, the sound returned. Softer this time, drawn out, like breathing. But it wasn't coming from the woods anymore, it was coming from below. The ground shifted beneath them, subtle but undeniable. Pebbles rolled across the dirt, and the fog above their boots seemed to swirl downward as though being inhaled. One of the men dropped his flashlight into the soil, and when he reached for it, he froze. The beam illuminated a shape beneath the ground, muscle-like tissue pressed against the dirt, contracting. The forest floor was breathing. The growl came again, but this time it came from everywhere. They fell back, stumbling toward the vehicles. The sergeant shouted for retreat, but the sound of the engines wouldn't start. The air stank of ozone and sulfur, and the fog thickened, rising into twisting shapes that looked like figures. The corporal turned his light toward one of them and froze. In the haze stood a silhouette, tall, lupine, its head tilted slightly as if studying them. It didn't move, it just watched. Then, without warning, it disappeared in a blur, replaced by the sound of a low, satisfied growl. The sergeant fired a flare into the sky. The red glow illuminated the trees for only a moment, but that was enough. There were more of them. 3, maybe 4, moving through the fog on all fours, and 2 legs alike, blending between human posture and something feral. Their eyes caught the light like mirrors. One of the beasts lunged forward, knocking a man off his feet. The others opened fire, the flare light painting the entire scene in blood-red color. When the flare burned out, the growls faded with it. The forest was pitch black again, save for the faint shimmer of smoke rising from the muzzles of their rifles. They called for the man who had fallen, but he didn't answer. His body was gone, dragged off into the trees. The only thing left was his rifle, bent clean in half, as if crushed by impossible strength. The sergeant lifted it with shaking hands and whispered, "It took him." By dawn, the woods had gone quiet again. The birds returned, cautious and uncertain. The fog began to lift. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just torn bark and the smell of burnt powder. The surviving men packed in silence, eyes darting at every sound. But as they left, a low rumble rolled through the trees, distant but steady, like thunder buried beneath the ground. The growl hadn't stopped. It was following them, just beyond the reach of hearing. That night, miles from the forest, they stopped at a diner off the highway. None of them spoke about what had happened. The sergeant sat near the window, staring at the tree line. When the waitress refilled his coffee, he asked her if she'd ever heard about the dogman. She smiled nervously and said, "You mean the one they never caught?" He didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying a sound too deep to be the breeze. A faint growl that made the glass tremble in its frame. Morning came, but it brought no comfort. The light only revealed how wrong the forest had become. The fog hadn't lifted. It clung to the ground like smoke from a fire that never went out. Every step the men took left a print that filled instantly with dark water, even though there hadn't been rain in hours. They retraced the scene of the night before, searching for signs of what they'd shot. The trees were torn apart, bark shredded and blackened by gunfire, but the one thing missing was blood. Not a drop, not even a stain. It was as if the bullets had passed through air. The sergeant crouched near one of the impact zones, his gloved hand brushing across the soil. It was warm. He pulled back quickly, his pulse thundering in his ears. "It's like the ground's alive," he muttered. The corporal leaned in, frowning, but he could feel it too, a faint vibration, subtle but real, pulsing through the earth in time with his heartbeat. He looked around at the others, realizing each man had gone silent, their expressions pale. The forest itself seemed to be breathing in slow rhythm. They spread out, moving carefully, marking the last place the creature was seen. Where it had stood, the ground was flattened and dry. Not a trace of moisture, not a hint of blood or tissue, but the trees nearby told a different story. Deep claw marks gouged into the wood, steaming faintly in the morning air. When they touched the grooves, the edges pulsed faintly red, as if heat still lingered within them. The corporal stepped back. "It's not bleeding," he said softly. "It's burning." The biologist collected samples of the black residue that coated the bark. Under sunlight, it shimmered faintly with iridescent color, like oil slick on water. When he tried to store it in a specimen vial, the substance moved just slightly, but enough to make him drop it. The material hit the ground and vanished instantly, absorbed into the soil without a trace. He stared, dumbfounded, then looked at the sergeant. "It doesn't want to be contained," he whispered. "It's alive." Radio contact with the base continued to fail. Every transmission returned only static, or worse, faint sounds buried beneath the noise. Once, the operator thought he heard a voice, soft and trembling, saying, "You can't hurt it." When they played the recording back, the message was gone. The sergeant ordered the men to stop talking about it, but unease settled over them like a physical weight. Each man could feel that same hum in the soles of their boots, that low vibration coming from beneath. They found more prints leading deeper into the forest. The same wide, clawed shapes as before, but these ones shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt. They weren't just impressions, they seemed to pulse. When one man stepped near them, the ground exhaled a thin mist that smelled metallic, faintly sweet. He stumbled back, choking, wiping at his face. "It's blood," he gasped. But when they checked, his skin was clean. No stain, no color, just the smell that wouldn't fade. The sergeant decided to follow the prints regardless. They led toward a slope thick with brush and fallen timber, ending at a small ravine. The soil there was scorched black, the grass burned away in irregular patterns. The edges of the ravine shimmered faintly, reflecting light in strange ways. It wasn't water down there, it was something darker, thicker. The corporal leaned close to look, but the surface wasn't still. It rippled, as if disturbed by movement below. "It's bleeding underground," the biologist whispered. They lowered a rope and lantern into the ravine. The light reflected on what appeared to be a wide pool of tar-like fluid. It shifted when touched, rippling outward, humming faintly. Then the lantern went out. The rope jerked violently, once, then fell slack. When they pulled it up, the end was frayed and blackened, as if burned. The smell that rose from the ravine made every man gag, metal, smoke, and something faintly organic, like burnt flesh. "We're not supposed to be here," one of them said quietly. They retreated back to the clearing. The fog followed them, rolling low across the forest floor. Every few steps, one of the men would stop, insisting he saw something move in the corner of his vision, shapes that disappeared the moment they turned to look. The biologist glanced down at his glove and froze. The tips were stained dark, not red but black. And when he rubbed them together, they stuck like sap. His stomach turned when he realized it wasn't liquid at all. It was growing thicker, spreading up the material like veins. He tore the glove off, throwing it onto the ground. The others watched as the stain sank into the soil and vanished instantly. The corporal swore and stepped back. The sergeant said nothing. He was staring at his hands. The skin along his fingertips had begun to darken, faint lines crawling upward like ink soaking through paper. He wrapped them quickly in a bandage, but the lines didn't stop. They pulsed faintly beneath the fabric. "Keep moving," he said, voice trembling. By evening, the fog had turned red in the light of the setting sun. It wasn't color from the sky. It came from the ground itself. The soil shimmered faintly, each particle glowing as if it had absorbed the bullets from the night before. The forest floor was alive, the way a wound stays alive after being cut. They could feel it now, heartbeat, pulse, rhythm. The creature wasn't dead. It wasn't even bleeding. The earth was carrying its blood. As night came, they found what looked like a trail of spatter, black, viscous, glowing faintly in the dark. But when the biologist bent down to test it, the liquid evaporated the instant the vial touched it, leaving only a thin residue that smelled like rust and ozone. The corporal muttered, "It's not blood anymore." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "No," he said, "it never was." Then came the first sound again, the low, rumbling growl from beneath their boots. It rose slowly, vibrating the ground until leaves and dirt began to tremble. The black stains along the trees shimmered brighter, pulsing with the rhythm. They stepped back, guns raised, but there was nothing to aim at. The sound didn't come from the forest or the sky. It came from the ground. The earth was growling back. One of the men screamed when the soil near him erupted upward, a burst of black vapor knocking him to the ground. The fog swirled around him, twisting, condensing, forming a shape that almost looked human before collapsing again. When they reached him, he was shaking violently, his skin pale and cold. "It's inside me," he kept whispering. They dragged him away, but the ground where he'd fallen was warm to the touch, and when the corporal shined his light, he saw tiny dark veins spreading through the soil like roots. They fled through the forest, not stopping until the mist thinned and the trees opened into an empty field. Only then did they notice the silence again, the forest behind them utterly still. The sergeant looked down at his boots and froze. The mud clinging to the soles was black, faintly pulsing with red light. It wasn't blood they had walked through. It was something worse, something that had bled once and learned how not to bleed again. Back at base, the samples they'd taken were gone, absorbed into their containers or evaporated completely. The report listed unknown biological residue, but the biologist couldn't shake the smell from his hands. Weeks later, he awoke one night to find dark stains spreading along his floorboards, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere, far away, in the woods of Michigan, the earth still pulsed with life, and the blood that wasn't there was still moving. By the fifth night, the Michigan forest felt less like a place and more like a trap. Every tree looked the same. Every turn led back to where they'd already been. The men barely spoke now, their nerves worn thin from the endless hum beneath their feet. Radios were their only lifeline to the outside world, the one thread connecting them to something human. But even that thread was fraying. Static had replaced most transmissions, though sometimes, buried deep in the hiss, they swore they heard breathing. The sergeant ordered hourly check-ins with the base, though each attempt produced the same result. Nothing. The static seemed alive now, pulsating in sync with the tremors underfoot. When they switched frequencies, the sound changed pitch, becoming rhythmic, almost like a coded heartbeat. The corporal joked that maybe the ground was trying to talk back. No one laughed. The air felt charged, heavy, as if listening to their words. The biologist muttered, "It's adapting," but no one asked what he meant. That evening, the fog returned thicker than ever. It rolled in from every direction, swallowing sound and color, until the camp existed in a pale gray void. The men gathered near the flickering lanterns, radios laid out like relics. The operator, exhausted, tuned across every band, hoping to catch even the faintest signal. Then, for a moment, the static cleared, and a voice whispered through. "Can you hear me?" It was the sergeant's own voice, but he hadn't spoken. The men froze. The operator turned pale, staring at the device. "That's not playback," he said quietly. "It's live." The voice came again, louder this time, repeating the exact same words. "Can you hear me?" The sergeant snatched the receiver, shouting into it, demanding to know who was transmitting. There was no answer, only a deep crackle followed by something like a low growl beneath the frequency. The sound wasn't mechanical. It felt wet, organic, almost like something breathing through the wires. They shut the radios off immediately. But even with the power cut, faint noises continued to hiss from the speakers. The corporal swore, stepping back. The operator yanked the battery cords, tossing them aside. The sound didn't stop. "It's not coming from the device," he whispered. "It's coming through it." They stood there, paralyzed as the static rose again. This time layered with faint voices, dozens of them. Some sounded like their own. The sergeant tried to regain control. "We move now," he barked, but the command lacked force. The men hesitated, eyes darting toward the radios that now whispered in overlapping tones. Fragments of their earlier conversations played back, twisted and distorted. Then, buried beneath it all, came a new voice, soft, feminine, trembling. "Don't let it in." The air went cold. The operator dropped his receiver. The forest outside shifted, and somewhere beyond the fog, something dragged against the ground. They packed quickly, leaving most of their equipment behind. The corporal carried one functioning radio, insisting they needed it for navigation. Every few minutes he'd tap the transmitter and whisper coordinates into the mic, even though no one was sure the base was listening. The biologist followed close behind, clutching a bag filled with half-empty sample jars that trembled faintly as if something inside was alive. The sergeant led the group toward higher ground, hoping the ridge might restore their signal. It didn't. Halfway up the slope, the radio crackled again. This time, there was no static, only a single slow breath. Then came a voice that sounded like the corporal, though his mouth hadn't moved. "Stop walking," it said calmly. "You're going the wrong way." The men froze, staring at one another. The corporal's face drained of color. The sergeant stepped forward, snatching the device and hurling it into the trees. For a long moment there was silence. Then, from deep in the forest, came the unmistakable sound of the radio turning back on. The static rolled through the trees like a tide, followed by faint whispers. Hundreds of overlapping voices, some pleading, others laughing quietly. The biologist covered his ears, but the noise was inside his head now, resonating through his skull. "It's not radio waves," he gasped. "It's infrasound. It's alive." Before anyone could respond, the sergeant's headset erupted in shrill feedback. He tore it off, dropping to his knees as blood trickled from his nose. The feedback died, replaced by silence. Then the voice returned, calm and deliberate. "You shot me." The men bolted, stumbling through the fog in blind panic. The forest twisted around them, every direction leading into more darkness. The ground began to vibrate again, stronger this time, knocking branches from the trees. The radios they'd left behind blared to life all at once, filling the woods with static, so loud it felt like thunder. Then came the growl, deep, rumbling, shaking the air. It rose through the static, merging with it, until every sound became one deafening voice. The corporal fell to his knees, covering his ears, shouting that it was speaking. The sergeant grabbed his shoulder, yelling over the noise. "What is it saying?" The corporal's eyes were wide, his pupils blown wide with terror. "It's saying our names," he whispered. The static flared once more, and then everything stopped. No wind, no sound. The silence hit them like a physical blow. They regrouped near a fallen log, shaking, breathless. The sergeant demanded head counts, but one man was missing. The radio operator. His pack lay torn open nearby, his headset dangling from a branch. The faintest whisper still bled through the speaker, a repeating message. "We can hear you. Can you hear us?" The sergeant crushed the device under his boot, but the whisper didn't stop. It just moved. They could still hear it in the air, faint and far away, bouncing between the trees. They pushed on until nightfall, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The biologist muttered constantly under his breath, reciting prayers he didn't believe in. The fog grew thicker again, glowing faintly from no source of light. Every so often, a flicker of sound echoed behind them. the hiss of a radio switching channels, the faint crackle of transmission. The sergeant finally stopped walking and whispered, "They're still talking." Just before dawn, they reached the edge of a clearing. The corporal's spare radio began to hum softly, though it wasn't even powered on. He held it out, and the humming grew louder, syncing perfectly with the vibration in the ground. Then came the voice again, faint but unmistakable, "Don't go back." The sergeant clenched his fists. "Back where?" he demanded. The voice didn't answer. Instead, static surged through the forest, rising like a scream before cutting off abruptly. The radio went dead again. The sun finally broke through, pale and weak, spilling light over the clearing. The men dropped their packs, exhausted. The sergeant stood staring at the horizon, his face blank. "We can't call for help," he said quietly. "They're using the air now." The biologist turned to him slowly. "You mean the frequency?" The sergeant shook his head. "No," he said, "the air. It's in the air." Later, when investigators reviewed the recovered equipment, they found every radio burned out from the inside. No circuitry left, only ash. The final recording captured a 7-second transmission. A faint heartbeat, a single distorted voice whispering, "Still listening," and a sound like static exhaling one last breath. After that, nothing. The radios had gone dead, and the silence that followed was the kind that never really ends. The pines of northern Michigan stretched for miles, dark and ancient, their needles whispering secrets even the wind didn't understand. After days of pursuit, the team's nerves were frayed to threads. The forest here felt older, untouched, heavy with a presence that defied explanation. The trunks stood impossibly tall, so close together that daylight barely touched the forest floor. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the crunch of boots on frost. And beneath that, something softer, breathing. The sergeant motioned for silence. They crouched low, scanning the fog-drenched undergrowth. Between the trees, something was watching, not moving, not hiding, just there. The corporal adjusted his rifle scope, trying to catch a glimpse, but all he saw were two vertical shapes that vanished the moment his finger brushed the trigger. He lowered the gun slowly. "It's playing with us," he whispered. The sergeant didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the pines ahead, where the mist seemed to ripple like water. Every few minutes, they would hear a creak, the sound of wood bending, like a tree swaying in wind. But there was no wind. The forest air hung still and wet, thick enough to choke on. The biologist paused, kneeling beside a fallen branch. It was split cleanly in half, not broken by force, but sheared, as though something sharp and impossibly fast had passed through it. "It's cutting through the forest," he murmured. "Not around it, through it." The realization sank into all of them like ice. They reached a clearing just before dusk. The ground was littered with pine needles that glistened faintly under the fading light, as if coated in resin. The sergeant raised a hand to halt the group, then knelt to inspect the soil. It was warm, again. Beneath the layer of needles, the earth pulsed faintly, like the thrum of a buried heart. The corporal stepped back, shaking his head. "Not again," he muttered. "It's under us." But the sergeant didn't move. He was staring into the line of trees ahead, where something massive shifted between the trunks. The thing moved differently this time, slower, more deliberate. It wasn't stalking them, it was waiting for them to see it. The fog bent around its outline, distorting its shape, never revealing more than pieces at a time. The curve of a shoulder, the gleam of wet fur, the reflection of eyes that glowed dull amber in the half-light. It stood there long enough for their minds to fill in the rest that no one dared to describe. Then, without a sound, it sank back into the pines. The corporal broke the silence first, whispering, "It's learning." His voice trembled as he added, "It knows we can't shoot what we can't see." The sergeant gripped his weapon tighter, but didn't raise it. The forest no longer felt like a landscape. It felt like a living organism closing in. Even the mist had changed texture. It wasn't vapor anymore, but fine threads of movement twisting in slow rhythm. "We're inside it," the biologist whispered. "It's not out there, it's all around us." They set up camp against the base of a large pine that rose higher than any of the others. Its trunk was covered in deep gouges, long and fresh, still seeping sap. The marks were spaced like fingers. The biologist touched one of the grooves and frowned. "It's warm." The sap on his glove shimmered faintly, almost pulsing. He turned toward the others, his expression hollow. "It's still bleeding." The sergeant told him to keep quiet, but his own voice was low and unsteady. That night, no one slept. They sat in a tight circle, flashlights off, weapons ready. The forest had gone beyond quiet now. It was dead silent, as if every sound had been swallowed whole. Then came the first snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind them. They swung their rifles in unison, scanning the dark. Another snap echoed, this time to the left. Then another, closer. The corporal whispered, "It's circling." The biologist shook his head. "No, it's testing us." When the first growl came, it wasn't loud, it was deep and low, rising from beneath the ground like a tremor. The men froze. The sergeant aimed toward the sound, finger trembling on the trigger. But the growl didn't stop. It deepened, spreading through the air until the trees themselves seemed to vibrate. Pine needles rained down like ash, and somewhere above them, something massive shifted its weight, dislodging bark in slow, deliberate chunks. The sound wasn't coming from one direction, it was coming from everywhere. The corporal fired a warning shot into the air. The echo barely had time to fade before a blur of motion passed behind them, too fast to see. One of the lanterns toppled, spilling sparks into the pine needles. The brief flare of light caught something tall, impossibly tall, moving between the trees, its surface rippling like liquid shadow. Then it was gone, leaving behind only the stench of sulfur and decay. The biologist gagged. "It's not animal," he said. "It's rot." They fled the clearing, stumbling through roots and branches, moving by instinct rather than direction. Behind them, the sound of footsteps followed, slow, heavy, deliberate. Every time they stopped, it stopped. When they ran, it ran. The rhythm never changed, as if it was matching them, studying them. The sergeant glanced over his shoulder once and wished he hadn't. Between the trees, he saw the shape again, only this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of faint silhouettes moved alongside it, each one mimicking the other perfectly. By midnight, they found a stream cutting through the woods and followed it, desperate for a way out. The water ran black beneath the moonlight, carrying the smell of metal. The corporal bent down to take a drink, but the biologist yanked him back. Floating on the surface were fragments of pine bark covered in claw marks, the same markings they'd seen on the trees. The sergeant crouched beside the stream and realized something horrifying. The current wasn't flowing, the water was breathing. They followed the stream until it vanished into the ground, swallowed by a dark opening framed by roots. The air pouring from it was warm, humid, and faintly sweet, like the smell of blood left too long in the sun. The sergeant raised his flashlight, and for just a second the beam caught movement inside, two reflective eyes staring back from deep within the tunnel. Then they blinked, and the light flickered out. The forest exhaled. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing near a ridge where the pines thinned. The fog here was lighter, the stars barely visible through the haze. For a moment they thought they were safe. Then, behind them, a single pine began to bend, not creaking, not breaking, but bowing slowly forward, as if something immense was pushing against it. The sergeant turned to watch as one tree after another began to tilt, a ripple spreading through the forest like breath through lungs. The ground trembled again. The corporal looked toward the horizon and froze. "It's still waiting," he whispered. The sergeant frowned. "Where?" The corporal pointed back toward the pines, where a single silhouette now stood at the edge of the trees, tall, still, watching. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It simply waited, as though it knew they would return. By dawn, they reached the road that led back to the highway. The fog thinned behind them, but none of them looked back. The forest loomed at their backs, black and endless, the tops of the pines lost in cloud. The biologist turned once, just before stepping into the truck. His face went pale. "It's still there," he whispered. The others followed his gaze, but there was nothing, just trees and morning light. Yet faintly, beneath the whisper of the wind came the low, steady sound of breathing. Something in the pines was still waiting. Long after they'd gone, the forest returned to silence. The wind blew softly through the needles, carrying with it a faint rhythmic hum, not quite natural, not quite alive. The trees stood still, their trunks lined with new claw marks glistening in the dawn light. And deep beneath the soil, the heartbeat continued, slow and patient. The thing in the pines had not moved all night. It didn't have to. It was home. By the time they reached the old logging road, exhaustion had turned their fear into a dull, heavy numbness. The forest had followed them for miles. Not literally, but in the way the air carried its silence. How every gust of wind seemed to echo the breathing they'd heard beneath the pines. The sergeant was the first to speak, his voice low and uncertain. "We're going back," he said. The others turned to him, disbelief in their eyes. "We left something alive in there," he continued, "and if we don't finish it, it's coming for us." No one argued. Deep down, each of them knew he was right. The thing hadn't been killed. It had only been waiting. Every night since they'd left the tree line, something had watched them, flickers of movement in reflections, noises too heavy to be coincidence. The biologist's hands still bore faint black veins that pulsed beneath the skin when he stood too close to soil. "It marked us," he whispered. "We're part of it now." The sergeant loaded his rifle and looked toward the horizon. Then we returned to where it fell. They moved at dawn, the mist still clinging low to the ground. The forest greeted them with the same suffocating stillness it had the first night, but something felt different. The air was heavier, thicker. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks slick with moisture that smelled faintly metallic. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into the throat of something living. The corporal muttered that the compass was spinning. The sergeant didn't answer. He already knew direction didn't matter anymore. By midday they reached the ravine. The same one where they had fired the first shots, where the creature had vanished into fog and shadow. But now the clearing looked wrong. Too open, as though the trees themselves had pulled back. The soil was dark and soft beneath their boots, faintly warm, as if the ground remembered them. The corporal crouched, tracing his fingers through the dirt. When he lifted his hand, his fingertips were stained black. "It's still bleeding," he murmured. The sergeant motioned them forward. The light barely reached the bottom of the ravine, swallowed by a haze that shimmered faintly like heat on metal. They could feel vibrations in the air, subtle, rhythmic, like a heartbeat just below the surface. The biologist adjusted his recorder, the needle flickering with invisible frequency. "It's not dead," he said. "It's dormant." The sergeant tightened his grip on the rifle. "Then let's wake it." They descended carefully, boots sliding in the wet soil. The closer they got to the bottom, the louder the hum became. The ground beneath their feet wasn't solid anymore. It flexed slightly, like a muscle contracting under weight. The corporal reached the center first and froze. "Sarge," he whispered. The others looked down. The soil there was moving, rising and falling in slow rhythm. "That's where it fell," the sergeant said. "Right there." He raised his rifle and fired a single round into the ground. The echo rolled through the ravine, bouncing off stone and root alike. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the vibration stopped completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. The biologist glanced around nervously, his breath fogging in the cold air. "It stopped breathing," he said softly. "That's not good." The next moment shattered the stillness. The ground convulsed, bursting upward in a spray of mud and black mist. The shockwave threw them to their knees. From the fissure rose a smell of burnt metal and decay, so thick it stung their eyes. The biologist screamed, clutching his arm. The veins beneath his skin had begun to move, writhing as if alive. The sergeant dragged him back, shouting over the roar, "Hold your ground." But the ground itself was no longer ground. It was moving. A shape began to rise from the fissure, tall, bent, and dripping with black liquid that steamed when it hit the air. It was the same form they'd seen before, but now it was clearer, more defined. Flesh stretched over muscle that looked half-grown, half-decayed. Its eyes opened slowly, reflecting the light of their lanterns, twin mirrors filled with hate and memory. The corporal fired, each shot echoing into nothing. The bullets didn't penetrate, they disappeared mid-air, swallowed whole. The creature straightened, its limbs snapping into place with the sound of breaking wood. Its chest rose and fell once, and with that motion, the entire forest seemed to exhale. Trees swayed, leaves trembled, and a deep, hollow sound rolled through the earth. It wasn't a growl this time. It was speech, a voice too low and broken to form words. But every man there understood what it meant. You came back. The sergeant didn't hesitate. Fire, he roared. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the ravine like lightning. The beast staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it raised one arm and slammed it into the ground. The shockwave knocked the weapons from their hands. The biologist cried out as something dark spread across the soil, creeping like ink through water. Where it touched, the ground bubbled and pulsed, sprouting veins of black that climbed the rocks like roots. The corporal tried to drag the biologist up the slope, but the vines were faster. They wrapped around his boots, pulling him back down. The sergeant reached for him, shouting his name, but the sound was drowned out by the creature's roar, not of pain but triumph. The air itself vibrated, the fog twisting into patterns that looked almost human faces. The corporal's scream was cut short as he was dragged beneath the soil, leaving only ripples behind. The sergeant turned his weapon on the creature again, but the magazine was empty. "You should have stayed buried," he muttered, drawing his sidearm. Before he could fire, the beast tilted its head, studying him. Then it leaned forward, placing a massive hand on the ground. The vibration returned, spreading outward, shaking the entire ravine. The biologist, barely conscious, looked up and whispered, "It's not trying to kill us, it's trying to become us." The ground erupted one final time, throwing them into the air. The sergeant hit the slope hard, rolling until his body slammed against a tree. When his vision cleared, the ravine below was still. The creature was gone, but the soil glowed faintly red, pulsing slowly like a dying ember. The biologist lay nearby, unconscious, his skin pale but no longer marked. The sergeant looked down at his hands. The same black veins that had covered the others were spreading beneath his skin, pulsing gently. He staggered to his feet, dragging the biologist with him. Behind them, the earth began to seal itself, swallowing the fissure until it was just another patch of dark soil. The forest went quiet again. The fog lifted. It was as if nothing had ever happened, as if the world had simply forgotten what it had seen. But the sergeant knew better. The thing hadn't died. It had gone back to sleep, waiting. When the rescue teams arrived days later, they found only the ravine and a trail of footprints that ended abruptly in the center. No bodies, no weapons, no signs of struggle, just soil that was warm to the touch, humming faintly beneath the wind. The official report listed the mission as unresolved. The area was closed off to the public, sealed under the guise of environmental protection. But locals still whisper about the sound that echoes through the pines on cold nights, a faint heartbeat buried deep in the earth. Because some say the sergeant never made it out, that something else did instead. Something that wears his face, speaks in his voice, and walks the edge of the forest long after midnight. And when it stops to listen, the ground beneath it shivers, remembering the day it was born again, the day they returned to where it fell. The reports were buried, the names erased, and the land sealed off. But silence doesn't erase memory, it only feeds it. Deep beneath the Michigan pines, something ancient still stirs, bound not by death but by recognition. The men thought they'd hunted a monster, yet it was the earth itself that had been watching, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake what it buried. Now the woods breathe differently, slower, heavier, as though they've learned the rhythm of human hearts. The radios remain dead, the soil still hums, and when the wind cuts through the trees on cold nights, locals swear they can hear boots crunching on frozen ground, followed by something larger walking just behind. Some call it a legend, others a warning, but those who have been close to the edge of those woods know better. The dogman never left. It just went quiet, the way predators do when they're still hunting. So if you ever find yourself lost along a Michigan logging road and the air turns heavy, if the trees stop moving, and the night begins to breathe, don't call out, don't look for help. Because the thing that waited in the pines is still listening, and it remembers the sound of the ones who came back,